he was a tyrant, and his wife was even worse. You see, they'd been on this state visit, and she was allegedly a scientist of significant abilities and qualifications and publications to her name and all the rest of it. So a program was arranged for her at Cambridge University to meet scientists in her field. And the whole thing was a fake.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
This is Radio Bucharest, Romania. Today, December 22nd, 1989, the dictatorial regime of Nicolae Ceausescu was overthrown.
5, 2, 7, 1, 6, 6, 9, 8, 3.
Poland's military leader, General Jaruzelski, urged the Polish people tonight not to demonstrate on Tuesday, the second anniversary of the founding of the banned trade union Solidarity.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
In this episode, we speak with Colin Munro, who has had an extensive career with the British Diplomatic Service. Today we speak about his time as Head of Chancery in Bucharest, Romania between 1981 and 1982. He provides a vivid view of a country initiating a policy of total repayment of its foreign debt by imposing austerity that impoverished its population and exhausted the economy. If you like what you're hearing on Cold War Conversations, then for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help keep us on the air. Just go to patreon.com/coldwarpod. That's patreon.com/coldwarpod. Thank you so much to our latest patron, Jamie Williams. Now, back to today's episode, where we start with Colin describing his role within the embassy. Colin, thank you very much for coming on Cold War Conversations. I wanted to talk to you first about your time in Bucharest. First of all, could you describe what the role of Head of Chancery is in the British Diplomatic Service?
Well, I can tell you what the role of Head of Chancery was, because the title no longer exists. The Head of Chancery was head of the political section, and he was also responsible to the ambassador for the coordination of the work of the mission as a whole. And that meant, in practice, that you had to have an eye on what the administration was doing, you know, the payment and rations and housing and morale. Morale being particularly important in a difficult iron curtain post. Nowadays, this work is really done by the deputy head of mission, and in the very largest embassies, you'll have a deputy head of mission who's basically an administrator, and then you'll have a separate head of political section. In Bucharest, in the time that I was there, we had the number 2 in the embassy was actually supposed to be responsible for trade, which we were attempting to expand significantly with Romania. But that didn't work out. And then when I left, we can come on to that later. The whole structure of the embassy was reorganized. But basically, I was, as I say, responsible to the ambassador for pretty much everything that was going on in that embassy, and with particular focus on the politics of Romania and the bilateral relationship between the UK and Romania.
Right. And at the time, relations between the UK and Romania were quite good, were they?
Well, officially, we'd had this state visit by Ceausescu in 1978. Now, you know that the Queen goes wherever she's told to and receives whoever she's told to, really. But the word was she'd said she'd never go to Romania as long as Ceausescu was in charge of it. The relationship was as I say, officially quite good, because Ceausescu had been critical of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 and was striking out on a independent or distinctive foreign policy. He'd opened up Romania had relations with Israel, for example, the first and at that time only Warsaw Pact country to do so. And Ceausescu was certainly striking a sort of a nationalist pose. I mean, people felt that Romania's position in the Warsaw Pact was interesting and deserved to be encouraged. But the closer you got to the reality of what life was like in Romania, the more you realized that this was really a pretty brutal dictatorship, and the foreign policy was a bit of a charade, really.
Right. And how much were you briefed before you arrived as to what to expect?
Well, I knew pretty much what to expect, because the previous sort of 2 years I'd been private secretary to the Minister of State, Peter, later Lord Blaker, who actually dealt with East-West relations. And of course, during that time, there was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And so I was pretty clued up on East-West relations.
Thank you for that. So how did you travel to Romania? How did you get there?
Oh, I went, it was quite adventurous, really. I went by car, and we were not supposed to, there was some difficulty about traveling across Hungary unaccompanied. So I went and stayed with friends in Germany en route, and then I went to Austria, and then I drove into Yugoslavia. I had a couple of days skiing at Kranjska Gora, and then I got on I put my car on a train from Ljubljana to Belgrade, and then I stayed with a friend of mine at the British Embassy there and had some interesting meetings. And then I drove from Belgrade to Bucharest. And the last stages, actually, it was a terrific snowstorm, and I was driving along the Autobahn, which had no markings, and suddenly I found I wandered onto the wrong side of the Autobahn. And so I had to go sort of back and cross over and everything. But then I got to the embassy, and there I was. Yeah.
And what were your first impressions of Romania?
Well, as I say, this was in late January. There was a lot of snow, and it was quite cold. Bucharest, what was very striking was that the snow was not properly cleared off the streets, and there was very little street lighting. So the place was in fact extremely gloomy. And my instructions were to drive to the Intercontinental Hotel, and somebody would come and collect me from the Interconti and show me where my accommodation was and so on. So I did all that, and even in the Interconti, the lighting was very, how shall we say, so subdued. So my first impression was one of Bucharest was one of wintry gloom.
Right. And in daylight, did it get any better?
Oh yes, of course. I mean, then the snow stopped, and the city, known as the Paris of the East, and it had wide boulevards and Arc de Triomphe and all the rest of it. And the winter facades of the houses were mostly in a very poor state. And as I say, the sort of maintenance of the streets and everything was really sort of pretty terrible. So and of course shops, such as they were, didn't have much of anything in them. Certainly not the food shops.
And what was the embassy building like?
Well, the embassy building was it had been a house. It was a very handsome villa in Strada Jules Michelet. It was not really entirely satisfactory as an office building. But I had what had obviously been a very nice living room as my office. The ambassador had quite a nice office, and so on. And some of the accommodation was a bit pokey, and I wouldn't say it was. It wasn't all that well maintained. We had a problem, you see. We didn't let Romanian staff, or indeed Romanian sort of decorators or anything, into the secure part, or the confidential area of the embassy. So it was a bit tattier than it might otherwise have been. And indeed, when you were doing decoration work also in accommodation, the Romanians, this was the system common to all communist countries, they had an office for providing services to the diplomatic corps. So if you and you said you wanted such and such a place painted, then you had to provide the paint, because they wouldn't provide the paint of any decent quality. And if you wanted you needed a locally engaged member of staff for your commercial section, you would get 3 candidates. Only one of them would be any good, and this was the one that they had trained up to sort of spy on you.
Right, so they were an employee of the Securitate as well as a decorator.
Yes. I mean, the head of our commercial section was a colonel in the Securitate, and he terrorized the rest of the locally engaged staff.
Right, and did you have to take extra security precautions to avoid being overheard and things like that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I was responsible for was keeping the staff briefed on the security precautions that they should take. We had a rule that, for example, the staff were not allowed to have local girlfriends or boyfriends, for example. Mm-hmm. You had to keep your personal friendships within NATO, or at least the EU. With countries such as Austria being a grey area.
Yeah. What about neutral countries? Were you all right with those or not?
Well, you see that not entirely, because the sort of neutral countries, the Austrians, for example, they did not have such strict rules about fraternization with the locals, and in fact, and then one of our members of staff was then having a relationship with an American medical student. There were a lot of students from Western countries studying medicine in Romania, because it was very cheap. You actually got a very good medical education, and you got much closer hands-on sort of opportunities with the patients than you would have got in a sort of medical school in London or Munich or Berlin or whatever. And this member of our staff caught VD from an American boyfriend, and the security Tati got onto this and started giving him grief, and we had to ship him out. And all this, of course, complete, you give people lectures on what they should do and what they shouldn't do, but they don't think it applies to them.
Yeah,
that's what coordinating the work of the mission as a whole could mean in a country such as Romania. And right. Then, of course, for our confidential conversations, we had a so-called safe speech room, which was a sort of lead box, which couldn't be listened into.
Right. So that's where you'd have confidential conferences and things like that.
That's right.
How did you foster relations with Romania? I mean, what was your routine? I mean, what sort of meetings?
Well, you had to look and see what sort of instruments you had. We had a British Council representative on the staff, and we had a cultural. And in the communist countries, the British Council were part of the embassy to give them the diplomatic protection that they needed. And we had a cultural exchange program with Romania. They would send so many people to Britain, and we would send so many people to Romania. And I mean, it was sort of heavily bureaucratic, but it did work quite well. And the Romanians rather prided themselves on their sort of cultural profile, and the British Council representative was quite a prestigious personality. And there were faculties for teaching English in Romanian universities, and we had a few sort of assistants in these faculties. And then, of course, there was also an outfit called the Great Britain East Europe Centre, which ran a visits program. And so we identified as best we could. We identified the sort of promising Romanians and would invite them on visits to Britain and arrange programs for them in accordance with their interests. We had a sort of a visit by a sort of a mixed commission of academic, politicians, and all the rest of it, and met with Romanian counterparts. And we had some sort of the idea was to open up dialogue with people outside official circles, and it had some impact. We got some quite interesting insights. And then, of course, there was the whole business of trade. Trade worked by means of so-called joint commissions. These were mixed commissions of officials, from our case, from the Department of Trade and Industry, and we might have someone from the Treasury or the Bank of England, and then the firms that were doing business with Romania. And then, of course, the biggest issue was that we had this was a sort of consequence of the state visit. There was a big contract that an aeroplane, the BAC 111, was going to be production was going to be progressively transferred from the UK to Romania, and we had a team of engineers from British Aerospace. It was called the British Aircraft Corporation in those days. Now it's BAE Systems, and indeed Rolls-Royce, because these planes were powered by Rolls-Royce engines.
And this was a passenger plane, wasn't it? The BAC 111.
That's right. It was a sort of medium-sized passenger plane, and it ran into trouble because the engines were, as I say, they were Rolls-Royce engines, and they were too noisy. And so new sort of noise regulations were coming in at this time. And so the Romanians said what to do, and the Rolls-Royce said, well, we will have to refit these engines with a hush kit to make them quiet. And this is possible. Said the Romanians, we're going to do that ourselves. No, you can't do that, because the specifications of these engines and how they actually function is a NATO secret. They're employed, and these engines are used in the RAF's Phantoms. So the whole contract ran into tremendous difficulty, and in the end, very few. I don't think the Romanians hardly ever exported any of these planes that were made in Romania. The trouble I learned once at a meeting held in the open air, I got talking to a Romanian aircraft engineer, and he said, we're absolutely crazy to be doing this. You cannot imagine how much resource of our engineering capacity is devoted to this project. It should be much better devoted to other things. And the Romanians had got a big contract with the French to build a highly sophisticated small car, a Citroën, and it was going to be called the Alt Cit. And of course, the ones built in Romania didn't meet the standards of Citroën, and the Citroën refused to market them. So there was a big row about that.
So with the BAC 111 engine, I mean, if it was a NATO secret, surely they could just pull it apart once it had been supplied to them.
No. The reverse engineering is extraordinarily difficult. They were Rolls-Royce engines.
Right.
And I learned about this later from a great friend of mine who worked later for Rolls-Royce, but at one time for Rank Xerox. In communist countries, they couldn't produce toner for photocopiers. Right. And you couldn't do any color printing and this sort of thing. Ralph used to tell the story of how he'd been summoned to Russia, and he found that the latest photocopier that Rang Xerox had supplied was all in bits, and they couldn't put it back together again, and couldn't figure out how it worked.
So our secrets were safe.
So our secrets were relatively safe, as far as these engines were concerned.
Yeah.
I think. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you ever meet Ceausescu?
I shook his hand once. That's all. Yeah.
What were your impressions of him?
I mean, he really was extremely sort of unpleasant. I just observed him, his behavior from a distance. He was a tyrant, and his wife was even worse. We discovered, you see, they'd been on this state visit, and she was allegedly a scientist of significant abilities and qualifications and publications to her name and all the rest of it. So a program was arranged for her at Cambridge University to meet scientists in her field. And the whole thing was a fake because it was the person who conducted the conversations was actually the interpreter. And we learned all this later after the guy became ambassador in London and spilt the beans. Ceausescu's lived in incredible luxury, at least by Romanian standards. You know, gold taps in the bathroom and all the rest of it, and ample supplies of food and every conceivable privilege, when the ordinary population were living the most dreadful life. The control was maintained by people who had, there was a sort of graded privilege system, and of course the security services were, so they spied on everybody. It was an awful system, really. The economy really ran into trouble. The slide started in a big way during our time. The communist countries ran up debt because they borrowed heavily and they didn't use the money that they borrowed efficiently. And Ceausescu decided that his version of independence was such that Romania was going to pay back its debts. And the way they paid back their debts was by throttling back imports. So you couldn't get pepper, for example, and producing goods that could be sold regardless of how cheaply until they had paid for their debts.
What were the embassy social functions like when you invited Romanians to the embassy?
Well, it depended. There was a sort of group of Romanians who had a sort of permission to accept invitations, although they were supposed to, in fact, in many cases, sort of forced to sort of report to the Securitate what they had seen and heard and talked about and all the rest of it. So I learned about this also from some friends after the fall of Ceausescu, and they say they would debate amongst themselves as whether to accept the invitation in the knowledge that they would have some nice food and good drink in a warm flat, an interesting conversation, and the price being that they would have to sort of report to the Securitate the next day. And so they would weigh up whether or not to accept the invitation. And then there were other people, some of them are rather old, who didn't care anymore, and the authorities didn't seem to care about them much anymore. And they were sort of quite free to accept invitations. And then on official occasions, of course, there would be the people from the foreign ministry would accept invitations and all the rest of it. If there was some occasion like an official visitor or a meeting of the Joint Commission, and so on. And I would say that the people who found it, and the sort of circle who found it easiest to accept invitations, and who were anyway the most interesting, were the people who were in the cultural field: writers, historians, painters, musicians, this sort of group. Then there was also, I remember we had a visit from a lady who had been involved in Romania in the Romanian service of the BBC during the war and all that, and she had a remarkable collection of friends. And she came on a visit, and we put on a sort of a party for her, and all sorts of people appeared out of the woodwork, but they were very reluctant to sign our guest book, for example.
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
Yeah. I would say, if I compare with what people experienced in Moscow, for example, we probably had a much wider range of contacts at a more interesting time than they did. And then there was also at that time the German minority was still about 350,000 strong. It had been 1 million before the Second World War. These were people living in Transylvania.
Yeah.
And contact with them was actually was a lot easier. And then there were the Hungarians, and it was very interesting talking to the Hungarian embassy, for example, because the Hungarians didn't think much of the Romanians, and vice versa. And you could always tell when you were traveling through a Hungarian or a German village, because they were much tidier and spick and span and so on. So that provided other circles. And then, of course, there was the diplomatic corps. We had a really quite intensive cooperation, comparing notes and all the rest of it in the NATO circle and in the EU circle. And then some of the other Warsaw Pact embassies were quite interesting. We were banned, stupidly, from talking to the Russians at that point because of the invasion of Afghanistan. This was 81, 82. But I struck up quite a friendship with a couple of East Germans, because I was fluent in that language, and the East German ambassador in Bucharest was quite high-powered, Professor Siegfried Bock. So one way and another, quite a lot of quite a sort of busy life. We didn't feel, as it were, as cut off from the locals, as in such difficulty as I think people did in Moscow, for example.
Right. And what did you do for food? I mean, I hear there were a lot of food shortages in Romania. Did you have food flown in?
Well, we had a sort of small commissary in the embassy, and we used to import goodies from the diplomatic suppliers, Peter Eustace and all the rest of it. Why? We even imported long life milk. Would you believe it? Because the milk was delivered to a so-called milk central, and it stood outside. It was delivered at 10:30 in the evening, and it went sour in the summer and it froze in the winter. There was a diplomatic shop, and you could get stuff, but you had to bribe for it all the time. Have you got nice fillet steak today? And he would say, oh no. And then you would produce packets of Kent cigarettes, and you would, I will see what I can do, and all this sort of thing. It was completely corrupt. The Romanians were not allowed to have hard currency in their pockets. So something had to take the place of hard currency, and that was Kent cigarettes. So if you had a waiter at a party, you would pay him a nominal sum in the local currency, the leu, and then you would give him packets of Kent cigarettes. And if you saw somebody smoking these things, you knew you were really in touch with a big shot.
Right, and so that became sort of like an unofficial hard currency.
Oh yes, you go into a bar and say, I'd like a beer. No beer. Put a packet of Kent on the table and say, do you fancy a Dortmunder Union or Pilsner Urquell,
Right. Right. Wow. Now, you were there with your wife, weren't you?
Yes.
And
our younger son, the older boy, was at boarding school. He came out for the holidays. He actually quite liked it because there was a diplomatic club. But the difficulty arose with our younger son because he was quite small. He must have been about, 78. He was 3. Soon after we arrived, he got a sort of worm infestation, and he was losing weight, and he was listless, and he had to get medicine from France to deal with it. And then he broke his skiing. He broke his leg, and it wasn't fixed properly. We were worried that he was going to have a sort of splay foot. Oh, and the worst was he had a suspected appendicitis.
Wow, as if you didn't have enough to worry about at that point.
That's right. And so we went into the hospital. Cigarettes had to pass to get into the hospital and all the rest of it. And then my wife spent a night with him, and they came. The hospital, it was terrible for the children and all that. I mean, all white and ghastly. And anyway, they wanted us to sign a paper saying they were going to operate immediately, and if we didn't sign and he died, it was our responsibility. And we weren't sure that he really did have appendicitis, and so we got in touch with the British Airways rep. Unfortunately, they had a flight coming up, and we managed to get him out, and he's still got his appendix. But my wife the night she was there, she got food poisoning, and so this was quite an insight into the Romanian medical system. It was pretty terrible.
My goodness. Yeah, I think
it wasn't that the doctors lacked knowledge. It was just that the nursing care and everything was very poor, and of course it wasn't properly financed, and it was very hard having young children in Romania because there was no milk. It was really tough.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've seen some of that footage of the Romanian orphanages, and it's just...
Absolutely. I mean, all that was we didn't really know about that, but that was all going on at this time, and all the time you see Ceausescu was insisting on paying back the debts, and so all the time the sort of consumer situation was getting worse, and the only things that weren't rationed were the things that weren't available at all.
Well, that's the end of episode 1 of Colin's time in Romania. There is a second episode coming up in the next couple of months, so stay tuned for that. There's more information in the show notes, which are at coldwarconversations.com/episode and the number 60. If you like what you're hearing in the podcast, you can really help us by leaving reviews on iTunes, Stitcher, our Facebook page, or with your favourite podcast provider. This really helps raise our profile and get great new guests just like Colin. If you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group where our guests and listeners just like you are talking about the Cold War conversation. Just search for us on Facebook. We're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod, and we're also on Instagram at Cold War Conversations. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.